This week, Oscar-winning screenwriter Christopher McQuarrie, the writer-director of Mission Impossible Final Reckoning, sat down for an interview in which he talked about the movie's first 10 minutes and how it had major problems and how he finally solved those problems. And I just did a whole video about how I didn't necessarily agree that he had solved those problems, which started like this. Mission Impossible Final Reckoning is a masterclass in what not to do. But I'm not going to show it because I watched it back, and what was meant to be a hard look at what can go wrong if you don't solve problems in the script had the potential to come off as a bit of a takedown of the writing. And I don't want to take down writers who are already suffering for their art. So instead, I'm going to put it to you that he didn't solve the problem because he didn't actually identify what the real problem was. And at the end of this episode, I'm going to tell you exactly what I think the real problem was and how to fix it. And you can see if you agree. This episode is about the first 10 minutes of Final Reckoning, so no spoilers here. Why do the first 10 minutes matter? Because, at least in the case of Final Reckoning, it's crucial for understanding the rest of the movie. And if you don't understand the rest of the movie, you don't feel it. And if you don't feel it, you don't like it. So, this is what writer-director McHugh, as Tom Cruise calls him, said about the problem he faced in putting the movie together.
And we pivoted and deconstructed the entire movie, and I built a non-linear version of this film and shot it to be non-linear in order to move certain critical scenes earlier in the story. And it was very clear as soon as we assembled it, did not work. So Tom said, just make it linear. I made it linear. Did not work. And when I made it linear, why it didn't work is every scene you put first was a scene where they were talking about the entity before you knew what the entity was.
Right.
Which is why we then created that opening, that cold intro that just says, here it is.
Okay, so I totally believe him when he says that the non-linear version didn't work and the linear version didn't work either. And I completely sympathize with this very painful dilemma where the writer is chased down a story structure alley into a dead end and there's no way out, metaphorically speaking. But here's where the red flag comes.
And that's the big lesson for Tom and I, over and over and over again. There's just a point where you just have to say it. You just
fudging.
Tell them. And
here's my question. Is the solution to just
fudging
tell them, or does the solution come way before the edit in the script? In other words, is the real solution to go back in time and not have the problem in the first place by getting it right in the script? McQuarrie and Cruise are famous for writing Mission Impossible as they go along, coming up with action set pieces first and stitching them together with extra bits of plot after the fact, which means we get many scenes where characters have to explain how if they don't get the thing with the thing, then the thing will trigger this other thing, and all the things will go full thing, and if that happens, all hope will be lost. I mean, to be fair, this is very much a staple of the genre and what we have come to see, but when those scenes outnumber the action sequences they're setting up, you tend to have a problem. This is a classic case of plot versus action, of course, and if there's too much of the former and not enough of the latter, we're not worried about all hope being lost, we're only worried about trying to hold on to what they said about the thing. The most extreme example of this is when they have to cut away from the action just to explain it instead, because they don't have time to show it, because the film is too long, because there's too much plot. The latest Mission Impossible opens on a crate. Just a crate, alone in the dark, followed by lots of scenes catching us up in a kind of existential previously on
the end of the world,
before we finally return to the crate and find out that it's a big phone that you climb into so that the entity can talk to Ethan in order to tell him more information. This is followed by scenes out of order from later in the story that haven't happened yet, which we don't know hasn't happened yet. Is this intriguing or is it confusing? So let's forget for a moment that this is breaking the obvious golden filmmaking rule that you should show, not tell, or that other necessary law of any good movie, which is keeping the story simple and the characters complicated. Just
fudging.
tell them flies in the face of another less talked about rule of thumb, and that is, don't give the audience information in the beginning of your story. Just make them lean forward. Give them something to care about. Information can come later. In the first few minutes, the job is not to tell us what is happening, the job is to bond with us. You're like a police liaison officer interviewing the child witness of a crime. You don't want to just go in there and start talking about what the kids saw. You get them to play with the Lego first and ask them about who their favourite superhero is. And then casually, when you've got them on side and they trust you, you slowly slide into that horribly violent crime. I have found that if I have exposition, if something needs explaining so that we understand what's happening in the first 10 minutes of my story, I have already lost, because the audience don't care enough about my characters, about my story, about me to retain any information. It goes in one ear and out the other. If, on the other hand, they're given an action set piece or a curious or intriguing scene or a heartfelt window into a character or anything but information, they will jump on the hook first, job number one, and then, through the magic of movies, they will be begging for information. In other words, wait till your audience has questions before you start giving them answers. How do you know you've got a good opening? It's its own mini movie, its own mini story. Rather meanly, let's compare the opening of Final Reckoning to the opening scene of the first Mission Impossible.
Come on, she's been at it too long. Now, give us the name. За друзей. You're that scum.
We get it.
We got it.
Intrigue, action, character, emotion, genre conventions the audience came to see, and no exposition. That'll come later, but not now. But it's here in my haughty high horse criticism I pause. Is the problem the script? Or does the problem, and therefore the solution, come even before that? Because all of this has happened as a result of a series of unfortunate events. For starters, Final Reckoning is really a part 2 to Dead Reckoning's part 1, which means it's not a traditional standalone movie. Secondly, that first film didn't do so well, so they had to uncouple this one from the burden of being an official part 2, which means it had to be kind of retrofitted to be its own movie, yet one with all the baggage of the film that came before, which had to be wrapped up. And in amongst that, throw in pandemics and writer strikes, and you got a whole soup of trouble. Thirdly, the audience do really need this information in order to understand what's happening. I mean, that can't be avoided. So, we know the problem came before the edit, and even before the script. But is it possible it came even before that? Because all of this only came about because of a whole other problem we have now of movies being forced to ape streaming series, which ironically started by aping movies. Maybe the real question is, are movies still trying to be movies, or are they becoming something else? And are they suffering for it? Is no one telling a story with an ending anymore? This to me is the real issue, because the real problem with the beginning of Final Reckoning is that the previous film didn't have an ending. And I know this episode is supposed to be about beginnings, but turns out it's really about the last act, and that we have a crisis of endings in movies, I think. Endings are what you are left with, the reason you want to go back into the cinema. The same way you get off an amazing ride at a theme park and immediately want to get back in line. Maybe in that rush to emulate series storytelling, we've lost that tight, satisfying arc that made movies so powerful. A story that starts and ends, that you can absorb in one sitting. A story that feels whole. A story that can change your life. This is not Christopher McQuarrie's fault. I believe that McHugh, who is a brilliant writer, an Oscar-winning writer, and the person responsible for this absolute gem, is perfectly capable of writing himself out of a story whole, within the script or without. Actually, I suspect what this really is a deadline problem. Here's a clue.
And we did it 2 days before we locked picture. We just said, here's just spell it out, just lay it all out.
Which I think means the movie was meant to play on a certain date and he was simply out of time. And many writers will have been there and know what that feels like. I mean, the constraints on something of this size, a franchise summer movie with a reported budget of $400 million and one of the most expensive films ever made. I mean, it must be like death is coming for you in Final Destination. So, if you've seen Final Reckoning, share what you think of the opening act. If you haven't seen it, go see it. And in the meantime, share what you consider are the greatest movie openings you've ever seen. I bet we see a pattern in them. And for advice on how to structure a movie without tying yourself in knots, watch this. Also, subscribe, would you?